Well, thank you, Pastor Rachel, and I've been really looking forward to this time together. As Rachel said, my name is Philip. I lead Foster the City. Foster the City is simply a movement of churches, including New Life, that just care deeply for vulnerable kids and families in our community, and we are working together to provide loving homes for kids that are coming into the foster care system. I'm excited to be here to share a message with you that I do think is pretty close to the heart of God. And a little bit more about the kind of mission and vision of Foster the City. But maybe the best way that I can do that is just to begin with a story. Kind of tell you about a beautiful little girl. Sadly, when this little girl was born, she had a positive toxicology report, which basically means she was born with drugs pumping through her system. So within hours, she was placed into the foster care system. And by the time she was 3 months old, she had already been cared for by 4 different moms. And if you look at the studies, the outlook on that little girl's future is probably pretty bleak. We know that if a kid comes into the foster care system, if they're not placed into a loving, stable home, about a third will spend time on the streets. Half will develop a substance addiction. More than half will develop PTSD. Suicidal tendencies for kids in foster care are 4 times higher than their peers. There was a study done by the FBI. They said that more than half of the kiddos that they are rescuing from human trafficking here in the States, more than half come directly from the foster care system. Wow. Like, I could just keep going and go, but here's my point. This little girl had a world of statistics fighting up against her. So my wife and I heard about her story, and we just said, man, if there's anything that we can do to be a part of this little girl's life, like, we want in. And so we brought this little girl into our home, and we got to become her foster parents. We actually fostered her for 4 years. This little girl's story was a little bit different than the kids we'd fostered before, though. The kids we'd fostered in the past all had the opportunity to go back home, to be reunified, reconciled back with their parents, which, if you know about the foster care system, that's the goal whenever possible, is to see families that have kind of fallen apart come back together stronger, healthier whenever possible. And that's beautiful, especially, as a Christian, we know we have a God that loves to see things that were once falling apart made whole. Like, we have a God of reconciliation, don't we? In the New Testament, we're told as followers of Jesus that we're to be ministers of reconciliation, agents of reconciliation. So we get to partner with God in helping to see things that have broken apart come back together in wholeness. Like, we get a chance to be a part of that. So the kids we'd fostered before all had the chance to go back home and be reunified and reconciled with their families, which is beautiful. We found out that wasn't going to be possible with this little girl. And so the judge and the social worker said, hey, she's going to need a new kind of option for permanency, they call it. And so after 4 years of fostering, we moved from being her foster family to her forever family. We got to adopt this little girl, which is awesome. Send a picture over. Do we have a picture? I'm not sure if we do or not. There it is. All right, that's our adoption day right there. That's her in the middle. Isn't she cute? All right? Yeah. And you guys like the color-coded bookshelves behind me? You guys appreciate that too? All right, thank you. Well, but let's focus on the girl. We don't have to look at the books. We can focus on the girl. Can I tell you one other story about her? So that's my wife sitting next to me. When my wife and I were first married, we've been married for 20 years, right? 20 years. It's a long time. We were babies when we got married. And before we had kids or whatever, we had all this time on our hands. And so one of the things that we would do together is we'd read books. We'd read book series at night together. And so one of those series that we read was called The Chronicles of Narnia. Have you heard of it? Okay. If most of you seem like you're familiar with it. If you're not, it initially centers around 4 kids. You have Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. So 2 brothers and 2 sisters. And so early on in our marriage, my wife and I were like, God, that would be a great number of kids to have 4 kids, 2 boys, 2 girls. That would be, you can't really control that, right? You can't control something like that. But we just said that would be pretty great. And as chances would have it, we ended up with boy, girl, boy. We had our Peter, Susan, Edmund. We didn't name them that, mind you, okay? we're not that into Narnia, all right? But we did have our Peter, Susan, Edmund, and we were missing our Lucy. We just missing our little Lucy. And so over the years, even as we got into our fostering journey, we were like, hey, maybe one day God would bring into our family a little girl that just needs maybe one day God would bring us her Lucy, a little girl that needs a forever family. And so even as years went on, my daughter here, her name is Winnie, she would start praying, like, God, she really wanted a sister. God, bring us her Lucy, bring us her Lucy, bring us her Lucy. And so one day, I get a call from my wife, and she says, Philip, there's a little girl that needs a placement. The county is asking us to come down and learn about her. So after work, I drove down to the county building, met my wife outside, and she grabbed me before we even walked in and said, Philip, guess what her name is? It's actually Lucy. Wow. And that's the little girl that needed a forever family. He actually gave us a Lucy. So over the years, I've wondered, why would God actually see fit to give us an actual Lucy? A girl we prayed for by name before she was born. For years, we prayed for her by name. Is it because he has a good sense of humor? Maybe. Is it because he wants us to know he hears our prayers? Probably, right? There's something else I've been thinking about recently. I also think he just wanted to remind me that, like, her name matters. She has a name. She is not just one of thousands of kids in the foster care system. She's not just some nameless number. She's Lucy. And that's true of every single child in the foster care system. They have names. Like, every number has a name. Every name has a story, right? And every story matters to God. And because their stories matter to God, just like Lucy's story matters to God, their stories matter to us, don't they? That's why we started this thing we call Foster the City. About a decade ago, my wife and I started our kind of foster care journey and started welcoming in kids who had experienced abuse or neglect, some kind of trauma, and they just were breaking our hearts. At the time, I was pastoring a little church in San Jose, and so one Sunday morning, I just stood in front of our congregation and just said, hey guys, what if as a whole church community, we were to find some ways that we could move towards kids and families in the foster care system? What if we found some ways to do that? We just started to have a conversation as a church, and we started to take steps, and that led us to build relationships with social workers in our area. And at one point, a social worker sat down with me. This is back in 2015. And she said, Philip, this is cool. Like, we like working with your church. We can do some meaningful things together. She said, but the reality is, she said, we are in, and this is the phrase she used, we are in an emergency crisis. She said, there are far more children coming into foster care today than we have homes that are ready to help them. And by the way, that's not just true in San Jose. It's actually even more so true right here in San Francisco. More than half of the kids that come into the foster care system in San Francisco, more than half have to be sent out of the city, out of their communities because of a lack of foster homes. That they have to be sent to other parts of the Bay Area, other parts of California to find homes. That means someone else in some other part of California is having to love your neighbor. There's something fundamentally broken about that. And so this woman, this social worker said, Philip, we're in an emergency crisis. She said, do you think that she said, this crisis is bigger than your one church. She said, do you think there are other churches out there? She said, maybe you guys can start what she called a faith alliance. She said, maybe you guys can start, linking arms together and help us to change this. Guys, it's been one of the greatest joys of my life, watching the way churches like New Life, leaders like Rachel and Caleb, the way families have responded to the invitation from that social worker 9 years ago. Today, we started with one little church, about 100 of us meeting in a senior center, one little church. And today there's over 300 churches now that are raising up foster families, raising up support for foster families. We've seen almost 900 kids now welcomed into safe and loving homes. We're not going to stop until there's more than enough. Yeah. We have this dream that one day there's going to be a waiting list of families rather than a waiting list of kids. And New Life is a part of that. And so I want to honor those of you who maybe you've been praying about this, you've been involved in some way. I want to honor the leadership here, too, that makes the care of vulnerable kids a priority. The church, at its best, over the last 2,000 years, the church at its best has been known as a community that moves towards the fatherless, that moves towards the vulnerable. And again, New Life is a picture of what this is looking like, and we're going to continue to grow in that as part of our DNA as the Bay Area Church and beyond. That was all my intro. I'm going to go faster, guys, I promise, okay? I want to take a few minutes to offer a word of encouragement that we might keep going. I know for some of you, this is the first year hearing about it. We've got a chance to share it in New Life in Nevada as well, and there's actually some folks from Foster City speaking there today as well. And this has been a part of, New Life for a long time, but for some of you maybe hearing it for the first time. My hope is that if this is something that's already been kind of birthed in your heart, that it would just grow a little bit. If this is something new, that he would spark something in your spirit today. I want to look together at some words from the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 12. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. Romans 12. We're going to look at 12 verses, verses 9 through 21. In these 12 verses, the Apostle Paul paints this really beautiful, incredible vision of who we were meant to be as the church. I believe that these 12 verses, what I'm about to read to you, is God's heart for New Life Church in San Francisco. This is what I think he wants to be true of you. Can I read it? Yeah. All right. This is what he says. He says, let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold to what's good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, but be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. And by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I'm going to stop there. That's a lot in those 12 verses. There's 29 different imperatives for the people of God. We're not going to look at 29. Take a breath, okay, guys? We're going to look at 3. I cherry-picked 3 from there that we're going to look at today. This is not one of them. Even just reading this is like, gosh, I got to say, if this is the first time you're hearing this sounds kind of funny. He says there at the end, he says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. That's a weird thing to say. That does hard. But basically, and I don't have time to go into it, that's from the Old Testament. He's pulling something from the Old Testament. He's basically saying, when somebody wrongs you, don't repay them with one-to-one response, like don't get revenge. Be kind to them. Be loving towards them. And in so doing, you might actually lead them to repent. That's what he's saying. You might actually help them, not just to actually turn their life around, if you actually show them love as opposed to evil. Okay, so don't let that get you too off track, okay? But like I said, I picked 3 things, not 29, that we're going to look at together. 3 prayers that I have for us. As I was praying about our time together, I wrote down 3 things. That you would be a person of open hands, wet eyes, and a spirit on fire. My 10-year-old son asked me what I was going to talk about today before I left the house, and I told him, open hands, wet eyes, and a spirit on fire, and he laughed at me. But hang with me, I'll explain. Okay, first, open hands. And of course, I'm talking about the biblical concept of hospitality. You see it all throughout Romans 12. Verse 13, he says, contribute to the needs of the saints. Seek to show hospitality. Verse 16, associate with the lowly. Verse 20, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. Hospitality. One of the favorite books that I've read this year is a book called Unreasonable Hospitality. It's by a guy named Will Guadara. Have anybody picked that one up? That's a good one. It's the story of, so Will was the general manager of 11 Madison Park in New York City. 11 Madison Park was a pretty good restaurant when he became the general manager. And he tells the story of 11 Madison Park going from a pretty good restaurant in New York to becoming a 3 Michelin star ranked #1 restaurant in the world. And as you can imagine from the title of the book, it wasn't just because they had some really great food. It was because of their unreasonable, over-the-top, intentional hospitality to every guest that came in their doors. He says that it all started this one day he was working in the restaurant, he was bussing a table, and he overheard some patrons behind him as they were chatting. They were from out of town, and they were just about to leave the city, and they had apparently visited all the great, a bunch of great fine dining restaurants all over the city, and he overheard one of the guys say, man, we visited all these great restaurants. I just never, though, got to taste one of those like famous New York City street hot dogs. I just wish I had a chance to be able to do that before we left. And so Will had this idea, ended up sneaking out of the restaurant, ran down the street, went to the corner vendor, bought a $2 hot dog, ran back to this like world famous chef in this kitchen, had this chef cut it all up, kind of plated it all nicely, drizzled the mustard just right or whatever, and then he brought it back out to this man and just said, I would hate for you to leave New York without a complete culinary experience. And the man was just like absolutely blown away. He had spent thousands of dollars in New York City up until that point, having some of the greatest food in the city. But he said that $2 experience was like the greatest moment of his trip. Somebody heard him. Somebody saw him. Somebody cared. Somebody took the time to actually go out of their way to meet the man and his desires. Like it just so moved him. And so he just, like that sparked kind of a new trajectory for that restaurant. I was telling my wife, after I read this book, I was telling her about all these different stories from the book of these things that they did, ways that they would get to know their customers before they came in, and they would cater these like really over-the-top, thoughtful experiences for every customer. So there was like a family that came, and they had their kids with them, and they overheard that it was their kids' first time seeing snow. They were from out of town, and it was snowing outside. They were watching the snow through the windows. And so when the family finished their food, they finished their meal, they were met outside with an SUV that had been loaded up with sleds, and they took the family out to Central Park to this great hill where they were able to take their kids sledding for the first time. There's just all these, so I'm telling my wife all these stories, and at one point she stopped me and she's like, Philip, are you crying? Maybe I was and maybe I wasn't, okay? But there's just something so beautiful, so moving to me about just someone feeling so seen and heard and cared about in these really thoughtful, intentional ways. Will actually begins his book with this statement. He says, most of the chefs on the 50 best list had made their impact by focusing on innovation, on what needed to change. But as I thought about the impact that I wanted to make, I focused on the one thing that wouldn't. Fads fade and cycle, but the human desire to be taken care of never goes away. Dr. Kurt Thompson, he's one of the kind of leading thinkers around like attachment theory. He says it like this. He says, we were all born into this world looking for someone looking back at us. And we remain in this mode of searching for the rest of our lives. For someone to see you, to hear you, to care about you, to go out of their way to meet your needs, to meet your desires. But listen, the hospitality that Paul calls us into, it's that, but it's so much more than that. This hospitality at 11 Madison Park that's so moving to me, it's for the wealthy. You pay thousands of dollars to have an experience like that, like a once-in-a-lifetime experience like that at a fine dining restaurant. The biblical idea of hospitality goes so much further. Look at what Jesus has to say about hospitality. He says, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Now, Jesus isn't saying you can't go and enjoy a nice meal with your buddies. He did that all the time throughout his ministry. But he said it's got to be so much more than that. The word hospitality actually comes from the Greek word philoxenia. It's a compound word. Philo means friend. Xenia means foreigner. The word hospitality means friend to the foreigner, friend to the stranger, friend to the outcast, friend to the marginalized, friend to the needy. And this is what we're called to. New Testament scholar Joshua Jipp, he said it like this. He said, the entire ministry of Jesus is appropriately captured in the phrase, divine hospitality to the stranger and sinner. That's the ministry of Jesus. Divine hospitality to the stranger and the sinner. People like you and me. Another author wrote it like this. He said, if you were to trace the hospitality of Jesus through a gospel, you would see that hospitality wasn't one of Jesus' strategies. It was the strategy. We show radical hospitality to the lonely, to the outsider, to the stranger, to the needy, because this is what Jesus did for us. I sometimes think we get it twisted in our perspective around Jesus. And we kind of see Jesus as somebody that's like, we just look to him to kind of help give us a bit of like a moral boost. Like we just have like some sharp edges that need to be refined. Like we're pretty good, but we just kind of need to get pushed over the edge just a little bit. So Jesus comes, kind of gives that extra little nudge. That could not be further from the truth. If you read the Bible, like Paul says, we were at enmity with God. We were enemies of God. We were those prodigal daughters and sons that had rejected God and went away and squandered our inheritance. And when we were far off, God came running out to us. He moved towards us in our need. And he brought us back into relationship with him, gave us a seat at his table. We were far from God. And now the divine hospitality that brings us back into family and gives us a seat at his table now flows through us and into the lives of those around us, doesn't it? We love because he first loved us. Jason Johnson says it like this. If this doesn't get us riled up, I don't know what will. He says, we cannot rightly raise our hands in worship of a God that steps towards us in our hard and broken, and then use those same hands to push the hard and broken of others away. So, to whom is God calling you to open your hands and heart? It doesn't need to be a kid in foster care. Maybe it is. But maybe it's just that person. It's that neighbor who's struggling. It's that friend who's falling apart emotionally. It's your buddies whose marriage are on the rocks. To whom is God leading you to open your hands and your heart? I want to actually share with you a quick story of a family who did just that. I think we've got the video queued up.
I remember taking my pipe and just putting it on the floor and just stepping on it. And I was like, I'm done. And a month later, Pattison was born on her due date, which I don't know how that happened because I had done everything you're not supposed to do while you're pregnant. And on the third day, they took my daughter and they said, we'll be right back. And they never came back. I went down almost every street around the hotel and just cried and just didn't know where to go. And I didn't want to go back to the motel because I had my room in the motel all set up with a crib and clothes. I just felt so alone and lost.
I was advised to be cordial but confidential because the bio mom was hostile to the first foster parents, and so obviously not really what I wanted to hear. They said be confidential, so I thought, is it bad if she even knows my name? So when I met Lauren, I didn't know what to expect, but as soon as we started talking, she felt at ease with me.
I was on my first unsupervised visit with my daughter. I was feeling so nervous. I have my daughter, and we can go wherever we want, and we can be back at this certain time. We can spend this time alone that I haven't had. She goes in my car, and we're driving, and Pattison starts crying, and she starts crying and crying and crying, and I start crying, and we're both holding each other, and we're just crying, and I knew she didn't want me. So I met them at Trader Joe's parking lot, and we're in the parking lot, and I'm just crying and holding Pattison, and Brian puts his hands over me while I'm crying, and he prayed for me. And I don't know what he said, but when he was done, all the guilt was taken away. All the guilt was taken away. Because when she was crying, it wasn't just a kid crying. All I heard was everything I did while I was pregnant. Everything I did to put her in a position to be crying.
Well, when we first got into foster care, or we thought we were going to start doing it, it was just, the focus was just all about the children and about, saving children. We didn't have any other really focus until we went through our agency's training, which was really good. And they kind of like enfolded us into the whole process of dealing with, there's a family that's broken, and you're there not just for the children, but there's an entire family that's out there that's going to be hurting.
Out of the blue, I got a text message from her, which made me cry. She had just texted me, Bethany, I need God and I want Pattison to know Jesus. And I'm like, I called her right away. I was like, we gotta talk about, you're making me cry. She's like, why? And I'm like, because this is absolutely amazing. And then to hear how God has just been working on her heart, it was exciting. And she wanted to learn more. She's hungry and thirsty. And so we've been doing Bible study together. She started going to church. She found one. They got connected in there. And so it's been amazing to see God at work.
They were my support. Bethany and Brian were my main support throughout this whole case after they got Pattison. They carried me. They believed in me. My relationship with them is still growing, and I love them so much. I consider them to be my family. I get my advice from Bethany. I watch her family because I want what she has, and I want what her family has, and I want how her family is. I want that for my family.
You think about walk by faith and not by sight. And going into fostering, we had a lot of questions. We had a lot of doubts, concerns, fear. There's a whole lot of emotions, and you almost don't want to do it, but you want to do it. And the things we feared most, I feel like didn't come to pass. We were so afraid that it would blow up on our faces and that it would be the worst experience ever for our family. And it hasn't been that way. I think we're always afraid to obey the Lord because we don't know what the cost will be. But in following Christ, the cost is always worth it. It really ends up being no cost. I'm like, we've gained more than had to, put out kind of thing. And God is always so gracious in that way. So, I don't know why we get so afraid. But yeah, we do. And we're going to continue to grow in those things. But God is so kind. He's so kind in his dealings with us.
Is God calling you to open your hands and your heart? Because that's God's desire, is that we would be a people of open hands, but also that we'd be a people of wet eyes. Can I pause here for a minute? I'm going to just talk to the gentlemen in the room. I'm going to call the guys out here for a minute. Men in the room, put you on the spot. When was the last time that you cried? Right now. All right. Love it. That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. Here's why I asked that question. John Tyson, he's a pastor and an author in New York City. He put out a survey, and then he asked this question. He said, what are the biggest issues that men struggle with in the world today? What are the biggest issues that men struggle with? And he said he got all kinds of answers. There's a lot of answers that you would typically expect. Those things like loneliness or lust or, immaturity, identity, some of the typical things you would typically think of. But he said he got this entirely other category of answers that kind of surprised him. It kind of shocked him. And you could kind of summarize that category of answers like this. What are the biggest issues men struggle with in the world? He said the category of answers was emotional numbness. He said that women would respond and say that they noticed a deadness in men's hearts. Men would talk about this inability to feel. Do you resonate with that at all? John Tyson would go on to say this. He said, life can grind a man's heart out. It can weaken and callous and wound and numb. We can just go through the motions so often that slowly our hearts shrivel, atrophy, survive. Listen to this. But we can also choose to position ourselves at the hearts, we can also choose to position our hearts at the places they come alive. The places of both beauty and brokenness, sorrow and joy. That's why Paul tells us in verse 15, he says, we are to rejoice with those who rejoice and we weep with those who weep. Friends, we have to choose to enter into the places where tears are the only appropriate response. The philosopher Albert Camus said it like this. He said, we were meant to live to the point of tears. And if we do this, if we move towards the tears, this is where we find Jesus. If we move towards places where tears are the only appropriate response, this is where we find Jesus. All throughout the life and ministry of Jesus, we find him weeping, grieving with those who were hurting. We see him weeping over death. We see him weeping over a city that is far from God and that refused to repent and turn back to their Father. Jesus wept. Pattison goes on to write this. He said, Jesus wept. It's the shortest verse in the Bible, and yet it may be the most profound. Because here is a God with sacred tears on his cheeks. Being a disciple includes asking Jesus to teach us the way of tears. Please listen to this, guys. Push back on the trivial distractions that rob you of your capacity to love. May God have mercy on our dry eyes, and may rivers of tears flow again. Our world does not need men with more charisma, or men with more talent, or men and women, by the way. Our world needs men and women who care, with tears in their eyes. That's what San Francisco needs. Men and women who care. My oldest son was 7 when we started our foster care journey. He told me that was the first time he'd ever seen me cry. Because honestly, up until that point, I'd kept much of the kind of world's brokenness at arm's length. I kind of kept it at a distance. A lot of that changed when my wife and I started our foster care training classes, and I began to hear stories about kids in my community, kids in the Bay Area. Like I heard stories that I could never unhear. Stories I still think about 10 years later. I heard stories about kids who had been just severely neglected in my community. I heard about girls who had been abused over and over and over again. I heard about babies being born with drugs surging through their little bodies. I heard about toddlers who were so hungry they would put their hands down the back of their pants and they would eat their feces. I'm sorry for being so graphic, but what if we stop holding stories like this at arm's length? These are kids this isn't around the world, this is in our community. Like stories like this should cause within us a visceral response. It should make us sick. I heard stories about kids who were coming into the foster care system after experiencing severe abuse and neglect and were having to live in the basements of office buildings for weeks or months because they can't find any family that will take them. This is not the way it should be. We cannot become ambivalent to stories like this. We cannot call normal that which God is weeping over. May God have mercy on our dry eyes. Jackie Pollinger, famous missionary, she said it like this. She said, God wants us to have soft hearts and hard feet. The trouble with so many of us is that we have hard hearts and soft feet. So I ask again, to whom is God leading you to open your hands? To whom is God leading you to open your heart? How can you share your time, your resources, your very life with those around you in need? And of course, you might be sitting there thinking, and all of us think this, man, if I do that, if I move towards my friend who's struggling, and I pick up that phone call when they call, or I move towards that kid in foster care, if I move towards that family that's struggling, what will this cost me? We always do a cost analysis. It's natural. If I move towards this person, how is that going to impact my time, my resources, my sense of security, my plans, my ambitions? But friends, surely your life, surely my life was meant to be more than just getting to the finish line as safely and comfortably as possible. Your life was meant for so much more than that. So that brings me to our third and kind of final imperative, and I'm gonna be done after this. We are to be a people of open hands, a people with wet eyes, and we are to be a people with spirits on fire. Verse 11 says, do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord. The phrase that we translate as fervent in spirit actually means to boil with heat. It means to burn with a passion, to be on fire, to burn with zeal. That's what Paul tells us we're to be like. How do we do that then? How do we stoke the fire within our own spirit? Paul gives two insights here in Romans 12 that I'm going to point out. First, he says, if you want your spirit to stay on fire, if you want to be fervent in spirit, you're going to need each other. All throughout Romans 12, all throughout all of his writings in the New Testament, you're going to see kind of just littered throughout. Rejoice with one another, weep with one another, encourage one another, lift one another up, bear one another's burdens, share one another's joys. It's all throughout the New Testament. We can do hard things because we don't do hard things alone. We see this happen in Foster the City in some pretty beautiful ways. As I told you at the outset, we're not just raising up foster families in our church. We're raising up foster families and support for foster families. For every foster family we raise up, we try to wrap them with at least 3 or 4 or 5 households that provide support. Here's why we do that. Because nationwide, less than half of foster families will keep going after their first year. More than half drop out within year 1. Fostering is not for the faint of heart. It's not easy. Sometimes the kids that come into your home, sometimes because of some of the things that they've navigated in their young lives, they might act out of that trauma. Not always, but sometimes. And that can be really hard. Other times the kids come into your home and you get really attached. They become like your sons or your daughter. Like they're with you for months or years and they just become a part of your family. And then one day they get picked up and they go back home to be with their biological family and your heart gets ripped out of your chest. It's really hard to walk through that and say, give me another kid. Let's do that again. It's really hard to keep going. So nationwide, only about 40% of families will keep fostering after their first year. You know what changes that? Is if they have community support. If they have people that come alongside them and provide practical, emotional, spiritual support to help them keep going. So we call those people support friends. A support friend, is bringing meals. They're babysitting, so these parents can go out and get a date night and keep their marriage alive. Or they're, going and picking up dirty clothes and then dropping it back off, folded and clean on the front porch. Right? They're praying. They're sending encouraging notes. They're just showing that it's more than just dropping off a meal. What you're doing is you're providing capacity. By taking on some of those practicals, you're providing extra capacity for the family to care for the kids in their home. So we don't, with this model, we're not seeing about 40% keep going after 1 year. We see more than 90% keep going after 1 year. Because we can do hard things if we don't do hard things alone. So maybe that's a role that God's calling you into, is coming alongside and supporting a foster family. We can't all do the same thing, can we? But we can all do something. If you are interested in learning more about Foster City, maybe you're interested. What would it look like to actually open up my home to a child in need or children in need and become a foster parent? Maybe you're interested in becoming a support friend for a foster parent. Your next step is the same. On this table right here, and then also on the table downstairs, before you walk out, we've got these little next step cards. I'm going to ask you to fill that out. If you do that, you have my word. I will not drop a foster kid off to your house tomorrow. I swear. All we're going to do is send you an email this week. And we're going to tell you about we call it an interest meeting. It's about an hour long. We have them virtually. You just jump on Zoom, and we're going to kind of deep dive into the different roles that you can play. There's another role I'll just kind of mention real quick. That's an advocate. Every church that we partner with has an advocate. It's a kind of a ministry leader in the church that helps to care for those foster families and support friends. I'm going to just highlight that role. I just heard from our team, hey, we could really use a great advocate at New Life in San Francisco. We've got advocates at New Life in Novato. You'd be kind of working in partnership with them. You don't have to have any experience. We train you, coach you all along the way. You kind of become the local leader of the foster city here. So I'm just going to throw that out there. If that's a role, come and talk about that too. But grab that next step card, fill that out, and then hand it to me before you leave. Sound good? All right. Finally, the second insight that Paul gives us to have a spirit on fire, it's in verse 12. Second tip, he says, be constant in prayer. Author, pastor Tyler Staton, he says it like this: prayer is the furnace that fuels mission. I think he's right. Prayer is the furnace that fuels mission. You want to have a spirit on fire? Go to God and ask. He'll set you on fire. Go to him. I'm going to invite the band to come on up. I'm going to kind of wrap up by just telling you about a moment, if I could, where I kind of had that experience, where I asked God to kind of stoke the fire in my spirit, and he was gracious enough to respond. We had just hit the 7-year mark with Foster the City, and I got my first ever sabbatical. I never had a sabbatical. I got 4 weeks off, guys, to just go and find some rest and refreshment. I was so stoked. Never had that. And kind of leading into it, leading into that time, I was praying, and I was like, God, I'm not looking for just like 4 weeks of vacation. Would you please really, truly use this time to like relight the fire in my heart for what we're doing at Foster City? I still cared about kids and families in crisis, but it had been 7 years. And I could kind of start to sense like a bit of like kind of a growing apathy in my spirit. And so I was like, God, would you just kind of like reignite the fire in my spirit for what we're doing? So the sabbatical comes, and the first 3 weeks was awesome. We went on a trip as a family. I had a bunch of alone time, read some good books. I went up to the Santa Cruz Mountains and had some alone time. And then the 4th week came. And I'm at Target. This is 5 days before Christmas. It's December 20th. And I'm in Target buying some kind of last-minute stocking stuffers with my sons. And my wife calls, and I pick up, and she's on the other line, and she's screaming, Philip, the house is on fire. So I race home. Sure enough, there's 4 fire trucks outside my house. We lost almost everything. It was 10 months before we got back into our home. That night, we were in the hotel, all smelling like smoke and trying to figure things out. And I told my wife, like, listen, Christmas is in a few days. Kids don't need to spend Christmas in a hotel smelling like smoke. Why don't you just pack everybody up in the van, drive up to Oregon to go be with our folks. I'll stick around here, try to get things going with insurance, and then I'll fly up in a few days and we'll spend Christmas together. She said, great. So she did that. A few days go by, it's Christmas Eve, and these like massive storms come through the West Coast. This is a couple years ago. You guys might remember some of these like historic storms that came through. Everything was grounded. I think there's a record number of flights that were canceled and grounded across the country, or across this part of the country. Mine was one of those. And so there's like no way that I can get back up to be with my family over the holidays. And so I'm in the hotel room, and it's like one of the saddest, like loneliest moments of my life. Like I couldn't go home. All my stuff was gone. The people that I love most in the world were far away. I couldn't get back to them. And I felt like in that moment, and it was Christmas, which just amplifies everything. But I was just sitting there on Christmas Eve in the hotel room, and I felt like what the Lord was impressing upon my heart was, Philip, I don't want you to look on the bright side. Which didn't make sense to me, but I felt like strong, like that was what the Lord was saying. So when people reach out, and Philip, how are you doing? How are you holding up? I would just try to be honest. This really sucks right now. This is really hard. I just really felt like the Lord is like, don't give me silver linings. I just want you to feel it. This is really hard. Don't look on the bright side. This is hard right now. And so I kind of just sat in it. And it wasn't until like weeks or months later, as we're kind of reflecting on that season, where I thought, man, maybe this is one of the things that God was doing in that time. In one traumatic moment, I was taken from my home. Everything I had was gone. The people that I love most in the world were far away, and there was nothing I could do to get back to them. I was sad, and honestly, I was scared. I was lonely. I didn't know what the future was going to hold. I'd never navigated anything like this before. It hit me that every day in my city, there were kids coming into the foster care system that had the exact same experience. Because of some kind of trauma, they're removed from their home. Everything they have is gone. They're removed from the people that they love most in all the world. The sense of safety and security is stripped away. And they don't know what their future is going to hold. Now, I really hesitate in making any kind of comparison like this. What we went through was nothing in comparison to what a kid in foster care. I was back with my family in a few weeks. We're back in our home. Everything's just fine. Right? But I do feel like for a moment, he let me kind of feel, just kind of empathize with what somebody might be going through in that moment when they're first taken from their family. And that day, at Christmas Eve day, can I tell you what I did, actually? I didn't just sit in the hotel room. I went to church. I went to 3 Christmas Eve services. Because I didn't want to be alone. Because I wanted to go to a place where I knew that people cared about me, that loved me. I wanted to go to a place where I could be reminded of who God is, that He's a God that moves towards those who are struggling and in need. So listen, when a kid comes into foster care, they're probably not going to go to the church, but the church can go to them. The The church can go to them. And that's what we're doing, New Life. We got kids who are coming in and having these experiences. We can move towards them, and we can love them and care about them and remind them that there's a God that loves them and cares about them. That's who we're called to be, and that's what we're called to do. So I'm not saying that God set my house on fire. Can I clarify that? I'm not saying that he's going to set your house on fire. And yet what I am confident of is that God wants to set you on fire. That he wants to break your heart. That he wants you to be a people of open hands, people of hospitality. That he wants this to be a place, this right here, this house, a place of hospitality. That he wants you to be a people that weep with those who weep. And that he wants you to be somebody that burns with zeal. Doesn't do hard things alone. But somebody whose spirit is set on fire. May that be true of us. God, I thank you for New Life, and I thank you for what you're doing the last couple of years here in the city, and for many years before that in Nevada, and the kind of the areas beyond. God, Lord, I pray that you continue the great work here. God, I pray that this area, God, would never be the same as a result of what you're doing in and through New Life in this generation, in this time. God, I pray for every person that's in this room, that God, you would open our eyes to where you're calling us to open our hands and our hearts. God, give us clarity to see. Help us to be able to see the people in front of us that need that kind of love and care and concern. God, I pray that you would not just give us clarity, but you'd also give us courage. God, we know that this is not for the faint of heart. There's always hospitality comes with a cost. We know that. So God, I pray that you'd help us to be a people of courage that would follow you and be obedient to you one step at a time. We love you in Jesus' name.